Everyone keeps saying this started with a comment, but that's not really true. What actually happened is that one sentence exposed a tension the league has been quietly trying to ignore. A rookie, yes, a rookie, looked at the situation, looked at the calendar, and said something so obvious that it almost sounded boring. And within hours, that sentence turned her into a target. When Caitlin Clark suggested that maybe, just maybe, players should figure out a way to get back on the court instead of risking an entire future season, you would have thought she committed an unforgivable sin. The reaction wasn't confusion, it wasn't debate, it was instant hostility. Social feeds lit up, accusations flew, words like disloyal, anti-union, and doesn't get it were thrown around with shocking speed. And the strangest part? She didn't actually say anything radical. She didn't attack anyone. She didn't cross a line. She simply said out loud what millions of fans were already thinking. That's when things got uncomfortable, because the backlash wasn't just emotional. It felt strategic, coordinated, almost rehearsed. And that raises a question nobody seems willing to ask publicly. Why did such a mild, practical statement trigger such an aggressive response? Why did a call for compromise instantly become a loyalty test? And more importantly, who benefits if that kind of logic gets shut down early? Here's what makes this moment different from every other sports labor dispute you've seen before. The WNBA isn't fighting from a position of obscurity anymore. For the first time in its history, it has real momentum, real attention, real casual fans showing up without being begged. And much of that momentum arrived fast, almost unexpectedly, which means it's fragile. Lose it once, and there's no guarantee it comes back the same way. That's why this feels bigger than one comment, bigger than one vote, bigger than one rookie speaking out of turn. This feels like the moment where two very different visions of the league quietly collided. One side believes now is the time to push harder than ever, no matter the risk. The other is asking a far less exciting question. What happens if you push too hard and the whole thing snaps? And buried in the middle of that collision is one uncomfortable detail almost no one is addressing yet. While the public argument is about unity and fairness, the incentives behind the scenes are anything but unified. Different players stand to lose very different amounts if things go sideways. Some can wait, some can pivot. Some can afford chaos. Others can't afford to miss even a single paycheck. That's why this story isn't really about a strike vote or a controversial comment. It's about timing. It's about leverage. It's about who actually has something to lose and who doesn't. And it's about why 3 anonymous voices quietly said no while everyone else cheered yes. Because once you start pulling on that thread, the narrative everyone accepted at face value begins to unravel fast. And what it reveals is a lot messier, a lot more human, and a lot more dangerous for the future of the league than anyone wants to admit. The moment itself was easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. No dramatic press conference, no fiery rant, just a calm, measured remark that cut straight to the heart of the situation. Caitlin Clark was asked about the looming labor dispute and the possibility of a work stoppage, and instead of leaning into slogans or taking a hardline stance, she did something that felt almost practical. She said compromise mattered. She said getting back on the court mattered. And she hinted that risking an entire future season might not be worth it. That should have been the end of it. A reasonable take from a rookie who had just lived through her first season of professional basketball. But within minutes, the framing started to shift. Her words were no longer treated as concern or realism. They were reinterpreted, stripped of context, reposted with captions that suggested something darker. Suddenly, it wasn't about compromise anymore. It was about loyalty, about whether she stood with the players or not. What made the reaction so jarring was how fast it escalated. There was no pause, no attempt at clarification, no room for nuance. Online spaces that usually preach empowerment and open dialogue snapped shut the moment her comments surfaced. Fans noticed it immediately. The tone wasn't disagreement, it was dismissal, as if the idea itself needed to be crushed before it spread.
And here's where things get interesting. Clark didn't say players shouldn't get paid more. She didn't question the legitimacy of collective bargaining. She didn't side with ownership. All she did was point out something inconvenient. Momentum matters. Seasons matter. Being visible matters. And in a league that had just captured more attention than ever before, disappearing for a year could undo years of progress.
That's when the narrative hardened. Influential accounts began painting her as naive, as someone who didn't understand the struggle, as a rookie who should stay quiet and fall in line. The message was clear. Experience didn't matter, context didn't matter, logic didn't matter. What mattered was staying on message. Anything less was framed as betrayal. But the accusation didn't quite fit. Clark wasn't speaking from ignorance. She was speaking from the exact place fans were standing. The stands, the broadcasts, the surge of new eyes that had only just arrived. She saw how quickly attention could be gained and how easily it could vanish. And instead of repeating talking points, she acknowledged the risk out loud. That honesty may have been the real issue. Because once someone with her visibility says, maybe this isn't the smartest move, it opens the door for others to think the same thing. And in moments like this, controlling the narrative becomes more important than addressing the concern. By the end of the day, what started as a thoughtful comment had been transformed into a controversy. Clark wasn't just a player with an opinion anymore. She was a problem to be managed, a symbol that needed correcting. And the intensity of the reaction hinted at something deeper, a fear that if this line of thinking gained traction, it could fracture the image of total unity the league was desperate to project. And that's when the question stopped being about what Caitlin Clark said and started becoming about why certain people needed her to be wrong so badly. On paper, the numbers look overwhelming, a 93% vote in favor, an announcement framed as historic, headlines celebrating unprecedented unity. If you stop there, it sounds like a show of absolute strength, the kind of message that's supposed to make a league feel cornered. But once you slow down and actually examine what that vote represents, the confidence starts to feel more cosmetic than real. The strike authorization passed during the off-season, when no games are being played, no tickets are being sold, and no television windows are active. That detail alone changes everything. A strike only works when labor is being withheld at a moment where it hurts the other side, financially or publicly. Right now, there's no active labor to withhold. Players are scattered. Some are overseas, some are training, some are running personal businesses. The league isn't losing money because nothing is scheduled to happen anyway. So what exactly did that vote threaten? Not today, not tomorrow, not even this year. The real leverage was pushed forward into the future, specifically the possibility of canceling or delaying a full upcoming season. That's a very different kind of weapon. It's not economic pressure in the traditional sense, it's reputational pressure. A warning shot aimed at public opinion, fans, sponsors, and media partners, rather than the balance sheet. That's why the timing feels strange to so many people watching this unfold. A strike vote usually signals urgency. This one signaled intent without immediacy. It created headlines, generated buzz, and forced conversations, but it didn't actually force negotiations to move faster in the present. And that disconnect is where the confidence starts to crack. When you look closer, the vote begins to feel less like a unified act of leverage and more like a strategic announcement, a narrative tool, something designed to project strength, even if the practical impact is limited right now. That doesn't mean the players aren't serious. It means the tactic chosen may not match the reality of the moment. What's being risked, though, is very real. The threat isn't that games get canceled immediately. The threat is that uncertainty lingers, that fans who just started paying attention are forced to hear words like strike, lockout, and work stoppage instead of highlights and storylines. And once uncertainty settles in, it has a way of quietly killing momentum without anyone noticing until it's gone.
That's the part the percentage can't capture. 93% sounds strong, but it doesn't measure how evenly the risk is distributed. It doesn't account for who can afford to wait and who can't. It doesn't separate stars with security from players living season to season. And it definitely doesn't reflect how fragile public attention really is. From a distance, the vote feels like a declaration. Up close, it feels like a gamble, one that assumes the pressure will land exactly where it's intended and not rebound onto the very people making it. Because if negotiations stall and the threat moves from theoretical to real, the damage won't be shared equally. And that's when the question becomes unavoidable. If the vote was truly about immediate leverage, why do it now? And if it wasn't, then who exactly was this message meant for?
Buried beneath the celebration of that 93% number is a detail almost everyone skipped past on purpose. 3 players voted no. Not 3%, not a block big enough to matter politically. Just 3 individual voices. And yet, those 3 no votes might be the most important part of this entire story. Nobody knows who they are. Their names weren't released. No one rushed to interview them. No anonymous quote surfaced. They disappeared into the background almost immediately, treated like statistical noise instead of people with careers on the line. And that silence feels intentional, because once you start asking who those 3 might be, the clean narrative of total unity starts to fall apart. It's extremely unlikely those votes came from the faces of the league. Superstars don't have much to lose by taking a hardline stance. They have endorsements, visibility, overseas contracts, and financial cushions most players don't. A missed season would hurt, sure, but it wouldn't threaten their place in the sport. For players on the margins, it's a completely different calculation. Those 3 no votes almost certainly came from players lower on the roster, the ones fighting for minutes, the ones on short contracts, the ones who don't have guaranteed income once the season stops. For them, the idea of a lost year isn't a negotiating tactic, it's an existential risk. No games means no tape. No tape means no leverage. And no leverage means disappearing quietly from the league altogether. That's the part nobody wants to say out loud. Solidarity sounds powerful, but it doesn't pay rent equally. A strike doesn't impact everyone the same way. When people talk about the players as a single unit, they erase the reality that this league has tiers, and those tiers matter when months of income and exposure are suddenly on the table. What makes this even more uncomfortable is how quickly those dissenting voices were brushed aside. Instead of curiosity, there was dismissal. Instead of discussion, there was pressure. As if voting no wasn't just a disagreement, but a moral failure. And that kind of environment makes one thing very clear. There's a reason anonymity feels safer than honesty right now. Because imagine being one of those 3 players. Imagine knowing that speaking publicly could paint a target on your back, that teammates might see you as disloyal, that fans might attack you without ever hearing your reasoning. Silence becomes survival, and when silence is the safest option, it tells you everything you need to know about how fragile the supposed unity really is. Those 3 votes represent a perspective that doesn't show up in press releases or social media slogans, a perspective grounded in reality rather than optics. They're not thinking about leverage in theory, they're thinking about what happens if this gamble fails, about whether there will still be a place for them when the dust settles. And here's the irony no one wants to confront. The league often talks about empowering all players, not just the stars. Yet in this moment, the players most vulnerable to fallout are the ones being quietly ignored. The loudest voices dominate the conversation, while the most at-risk voices fade into the background. Which raises an unsettling possibility. What if those 3 players aren't out of touch at all? What if they're not uninformed or scared?
What if they're simply the only ones being completely honest about what a lost season would actually cost? Because once you recognize that, it becomes a lot harder to pretend this vote was as straightforward as it looked. This is where the conversation starts to get uncomfortable and where a lot of people suddenly stop asking questions. Because once you move past slogans like unity and solidarity, you run into something far messier: incentives. Not intentions, not values, incentives. And in this situation, those incentives don't line up nearly as cleanly as the public narrative suggests. Several of the most influential voices pushing the hardest line in these negotiations aren't just players, they're also business owners. Breanna Stewart and Nafisa Collier are publicly known as co-founders of Unrivaled, an alternative women's basketball league. That fact alone doesn't make them villains. It doesn't automatically mean bad faith, but it does change the optics in a way that's impossible to ignore. If the main league thrives, they still win. If the main league stumbles or even pauses, they might win more. That's not an accusation, it's a reality of overlapping interests. When people wear multiple hats, those hats don't just disappear at the negotiating table. And when fans point this out, they're not inventing conspiracies out of thin air. They're reacting to a basic question: how can leadership positions remain entirely neutral when the outcome of a stalled season could directly benefit another venture tied to the same people?
Even if every move is made with the purest intentions, perception matters. In labor disputes, perception can shape public support faster than facts ever will. And right now, the perception for many fans is that the loudest voices advocating maximum confrontation are also the ones best insulated from the fallout. Meanwhile, players without ownership stakes, without leverage, without alternative income streams are being asked to take the same risk under the banner of unity. That's where solidarity starts to feel less like equality and more like pressure. Because saying we're all in this together sounds very different depending on how much you stand to lose. It's been said that no one player is bigger than the league, but financially speaking, not all players are exposed in the same way. Some can afford a long standoff. Some can pivot to other platforms or leagues. Others are dependent on the stability and visibility of the WNBA season itself. When those realities collide, solidarity becomes a much harder thing to maintain authentically. What's striking is how quickly this topic becomes taboo. The moment someone brings up potential conflicts of interest, the conversation shuts down. They're accused of undermining the movement or creating division. But avoiding the discussion doesn't make the incentives disappear. It just pushes them underground, where they quietly shape decisions anyway. And this is where Caitlin Clark inadvertently stepped on a landmine. By suggesting compromise, she wasn't just challenging a negotiating tactic, she was threatening to expose the idea that not everyone benefits equally from going nuclear. That's a dangerous thought in any movement built on presenting a single unified front. Because once fans start questioning whether everyone pushing the hardest line actually needs the season to happen, the entire moral high ground becomes harder to defend. The issue stops being players versus league and starts becoming which players can afford chaos and which can't. And that's the tension nobody wants to name outright. Solidarity sounds powerful, but when incentives diverge, maintaining that illusion requires silencing anyone who points it out. Here's the part that gets completely ignored in these debates. Casual fans don't behave the way insiders think they do. They don't read labor updates. They don't parse negotiation language. They don't follow players from platform to platform out of loyalty to a business structure. They show up because it's easy, familiar, and available. The moment any of those things disappear, so do they.
The recent surge in attention for the WNBA wasn't built on die-hard fandom alone. It came from people who decided, almost on a whim, to give women's basketball a shot. They turned on a game because it was there, because it was being talked about, because highlights were everywhere. That kind of audience growth is fragile by nature. It's curiosity, not commitment. Fragmenting that experience is how momentum quietly dies. When leagues fracture or content gets scattered, most viewers don't chase it. They don't go searching for alternate apps, new platforms, or unfamiliar schedules. They don't support the cause by navigating confusing ecosystems. They simply move on. Sports fans are creatures of habit, and casual fans are even less forgiving. If it stops showing up where they expect it to be, something else fills the gap. We've seen this story play out over and over again in other spaces. Big names move to exclusive platforms. New ventures promise massive followings, and then the numbers don't follow. Not because the product suddenly got worse, but because friction kills attention. The more effort it takes to watch something, the fewer people bother. That reality matters a lot right now. The league didn't just gain viewers, it gained timing, cultural relevance, a moment where people were finally paying attention without being told they should. Interrupting that moment is dangerous, especially when those new fans don't have years of emotional investment keeping them loyal. Alternative leagues may look promising on paper, new brands, new ideas, star power, but infrastructure isn't built overnight. Broadcast reach, media partnerships, promotion pipelines, those are things the WNBA spent decades developing. You can't just press pause on that ecosystem and expect fans to seamlessly follow the sport somewhere else. And here's the part no one likes admitting. If the product disappears or fractures, most casual viewers won't feel betrayed. They won't wait. They'll shrug, find another sport, another storyline, another viral moment, and keep moving. By the time things stabilize, their attention will be gone, and getting it back will be harder than building it in the first place.
This is why the idea that fans will simply follow the players wherever they go is more hopeful than realistic. Hardcore supporters might, insiders might, but the massive wave of newcomers that just arrived, they didn't sign up for a scavenger hunt. They signed up to watch basketball. And once that reality sinks in, the stakes of risking a fractured season become impossible to ignore. Because losing games doesn't just affect the present, it reshapes the future in ways that are almost impossible to undo. For all the talk about strength, unity, and leverage, one question keeps hanging in the air unanswered. Does the union actually have the upper hand here, or does it just sound like it does? Because when you strip away the chants, the hashtags, and the press statements, leverage isn't about how loud you are. It's about how much the other side needs you in that exact moment. Right now, the union's biggest weapon is the threat of future disruption, not present damage. That distinction matters. The league isn't scrambling to replace games that are currently being missed. Sponsors aren't pulling out of live broadcasts. Networks aren't renegotiating ad slots under pressure. Everything that gives a labor stoppage real teeth is still hypothetical. And hypothetical threats only work if the other side believes you'll actually follow through. This is where the math starts to get uncomfortable. The league knows something the public rhetoric tries to gloss over. Missing an off-season doesn't hurt them financially the way it hurts players. A lost season would be ugly, yes, but the league has survived ugly before. It has institutional backing, long-term partners, and the ability to wait. The clock doesn't apply equally to both sides. The union, on the other hand, is asking the league to believe it's willing to sacrifice the single most important season in its recent history. That's a massive ask. And it assumes the league doesn't see the same numbers everyone else does. Viewership spikes, attendance growth, corporate interest.
That momentum isn't just a win for the players, it's an asset for the league too. One they may be more willing to protect by waiting than the union expects. Then there's the issue of messaging. The league's public responses so far have been calm, measured, and detail-focused. They've emphasized structural changes, long-term salary growth, and models tied to revenue. They've avoided emotional language. The union's messaging, by contrast, has been louder, sharper, and heavier on moral framing. That contrast isn't accidental, it's strategic, but it also creates risk. Because when one side is talking spreadsheets and the other is talking slogans, undecided fans don't always land where you expect them to, especially new fans, especially casual viewers. They don't instinctively side with the louder voice. They side with whatever feels stable. And stability is a powerful illusion to project. Another inconvenient reality is that alternative options, often cited as leverage, aren't as expansive as they sound. Not every player can slot into a different league. Not every roster spot exists. Not every paycheck materializes just because an alternative exists in theory. The idea that the entire player base can simply pivot elsewhere dramatically overestimates how flexible the ecosystem actually is. That's why some people inside the sport are quietly questioning whether this is a bluff or a bet. Because if the league calls it and holds steady, the union has to decide whether it's really prepared to push the red button. Backing down later would weaken future negotiations. Following through could permanently alter the league's trajectory. And that brings us back to why certain comments triggered such intense reactions. Suggesting compromise in a moment like this doesn't just sound reasonable, it threatens the entire leverage strategy. If too many people start believing a deal is close, or that the league's offer isn't as bad as advertised, the power of the threat evaporates. So the real battle right now isn't just happening at the negotiation table, it's happening in public perception, in whether fans believe the union holds the cards, or whether they start suspecting the deck isn't stacked the way they've been told. Because once that doubt creeps in, everything changes. When you step back and look at how this unfolded, it becomes clear that Caitlin Clark wasn't attacked because she was wrong. She was attacked because of who she is in this moment. Timing matters. Influence matters. And right now, no player in the league carries more symbolic weight with casual fans than she does.
Clark isn't just another voice in the locker room. She's the bridge. The player a huge wave of new viewers associate with their first real exposure to the league. For many of them, she is the WNBA in practical terms. That makes her words different, heavier, more dangerous to a tightly controlled narrative. When someone like that suggests a middle ground, it doesn't land like a personal opinion. It lands like a permission slip for others to think the same way. That's why the reaction was so immediate. The goal wasn't to debate her logic, it was to discredit the messenger before the message could spread. Because if Clark's comment had lingered without pushback, it would have normalized a question leadership desperately didn't want normalized. What if compromise isn't weakness? What if protecting the season actually protects the players? In moments like this, movements often create symbols, heroes and villains, allies and traitors. And Clark was an easy target. She's new. She doesn't have decades of history in labor fights. She hasn't paid the dues some veterans believe earn credibility. That made it simple to frame her as naive, uninformed, or selfish, even if none of those labels actually fit. There was also a strategic advantage in singling her out. If the biggest name with the newest fans could be publicly corrected, everyone else would get the message. Speak out of line, and this is what happens. It's a warning disguised as outrage. Not just to rookies, but to anyone quietly questioning the plan. What made it even more effective was how moral language was used. The backlash wasn't framed as disagreement, it was framed as betrayal. Once a debate is positioned as a question of loyalty, logic becomes irrelevant. You don't have to prove someone wrong if you can convince people they're untrustworthy. And that's the irony.
Clark didn't undermine players. She didn't side with ownership. She didn't reject collective bargaining. She voiced concern about losing momentum at the exact moment momentum mattered most. But that concern threatened a strategy built on projecting absolute unity, even if that unity was more fragile behind the scenes than anyone wanted to admit. The louder the response grew, the clearer it became that this wasn't really about her words. It was about control, about ensuring that only one version of events could exist publicly. And in that environment, someone with her visibility couldn't be allowed to blur the lines. By turning Caitlin Clark into the symbol of what not to say, the message was reinforced without ever being spoken directly. Compromise was painted as cowardice, caution as disloyalty, and realism as betrayal. But symbols cut both ways, and once fans realize why she was targeted, it becomes harder to ignore the possibility that her comment struck a nerve, not because it was harmful, but because it was dangerously reasonable. When you strip away the noise, the hashtags, and the posturing, what's left is a risk that has no real winner. Not if this drags on. Not if a season disappears. Not if momentum dies while everyone argues about who stood firmer. Because in that scenario, everyone walks away with less, even the people who think they're protected. If a future season is lost, the league takes a hit, but it survives. It always has. Infrastructure doesn't vanish overnight. Media deals pause, not disappear. Institutional backing remains. Time is a cushion ownership can afford. Players, especially those without security, don't have that luxury. A missed year isn't just a delayed paycheck, it's lost exposure, lost relevance, lost opportunities that never come back the same way. And the cruel truth is that the people hurt most won't be the ones leading the charge. It won't be the stars with brands and backup plans. It won't be the voices loudest on social media. It'll be the players trying to hold on to roster spots, the rookies needing reps, the women who depend on the league actually existing each year to justify their place in it. This is why the entire situation feels so fragile. The league is finally at a point where outside audiences are watching without being forced to, where conversation happens organically, where attention isn't begged for, it's given. Risking that for a game of brinkmanship is dangerous, no matter how justified the underlying demands may be. And here's the part that makes this uncomfortable. None of this means players don't deserve more. They do. The system has lagged behind their value for years. Growth should benefit them directly. That argument is valid. What's questionable is whether this particular moment and this particular strategy maximizes that outcome or jeopardizes it.
That's where voices like Caitlin Clark become inconvenient. Because she wasn't dismissing fairness, she was acknowledging timing. She was pointing at something easy to ignore when you're locked into a narrative. Momentum, once lost, doesn't come back on command. What makes this so tense isn't that people disagree, it's that disagreement has become unacceptable. Compromise is treated like surrender, caution like betrayal, and realism like weakness. That's how movement stops self-correcting. That's how avoidable damage happens. Most likely a deal still gets done. Cooler heads usually win even if they don't get credit. Salaries go up, structures shift, both sides declare progress. But the residue of this moment won't disappear so easily. The public targeting, the silenced dissent, the suspicion about incentives. Casual fans see that stuff, even if insiders pretend they don't. And if there's one thing history has shown over and over again, it's this. Momentum is far harder to rebuild than it is to protect. Lose it once, and you may never get the same version back. That's the real risk here. Not who blinks first, not who wins the headline, but whether everyone involved realizes just in time that in this standoff, pushing too far doesn't create strength, it creates damage that no one can fully undo.